ننتقل للمتحدث الثاني، أستاذ مجدي أمين، مستشار الاقتصادي، برضو حيكون معانا أونلاين. حيقدم لنا ورقة بعنوان الإصلاح الاقتصادي، التسهيلات الائتمانية ومشروع الهيبك.
شكرا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ثانك يو. أنا معلش أنا هقدم الورقة بالإنجليزي. أنا شفت سيف الدين يعني اديتني فرصة. بعدين معلش إنه أنا كنت عاوز أسافر أكون معكم شخصيا، لكن ما قدرت أسافر هذا الوقت. طيب, the paper is on stabilization and adjustment, debt relief, reform, and investment. I think we have had many comments that have covered some of the ground that I wanted to cover. So I'll try to go through it more quickly that way. But it's a little bit of a background given where we are in terms of our starting point, what we achieved in HIPC, and a little bit of a few comments on the way forward based on the findings of some of the papers that we've listened to today. So we talked a lot about economic growth, and we know that Sudan has had many periods of very high economic growth, but generally not sustained. And if you could divide Sudan's history into phases, you had the 60s, you had a military regime up until 1972 that was more or less more socialist, and then post-72, 73, after the peace accord and the breadbasket strategy, there was a lot of investment, which drove growth very high, but then that was also not sustained, and then conflict reemerged. There were some structural reforms, and then the oil boom, but even that was eventually not sustained. So you've had periods of rapid growth, and especially since 2007, very slow or negative growth, because we never built during those periods the foundations for sustainable growth. And so if we are talking about sustained long-term growth,
Dr. Magdy, I'm sorry, can you just share it in a full screen so we can see the presentation?
Okay, well, it is full screen, but let me see what else I can do.
In fact, it's very clear for us here.
Okay, it's full screen on my side. I don't know, maybe on the whoever's controlling the screen on that side can adjust. So we need to think about how to produce sustained growth, taking into account the starting conditions we have now, lessons of experience, and of course, sensitivity to the political economy, making some clear trade-offs, leading to an updated program to drive further debt relief and investment. Our starting conditions we've talked a lot about today: inequality of opportunity, an economy subject to major shocks, whether natural, conflict, demographic, rapid changes in neighboring countries. You mentioned, for example, the African Free Trade Agreement, but also the rapid growth in Ethiopia and to some extent Kenya. All of these, to some extent, become things we have to adapt to. Our regions are disconnected. We talked about a little bit earlier about growth corridors, but the fact is the infrastructure doesn't so far allow connectivity across our regions, and it limits the options for diversification and economic integration. Corruption, bad governance, and distrust among all parties. Years of declining growth, short-term survival focus, which limit long-term investment, very rapid population growth and unemployment, a middle class that's been depleted and battered by declining public services, limited public sector capacity, and a development bargain versus a political bargain. There's a lot of, as Dr. Ibrahim mentioned, the literature, countries that succeed are committed to a development goal, of a development bargain. But the discussion mostly these days is about what is the political bargain? How do we divide the pie rather than grow the pie? So these are the kinds of conditions we have to take into account when we think about the program as we develop it. So I would characterize this as a stolen future for a young country with a median age of less than 20 years old. And if our goal is of economic policies to give Sudan, the citizens, back their future, the moment calls for an economy that supports nation building, inclusive, resilient, and flexible, more decentralized, at least 5 to 7% growth on a sustained basis, ideally up to a decade, politically supported domestically and internationally, and requiring regions to be connected. It's productivity that drives growth, not natural resources or investment. I was asked to speak about investment, but really I want to bring it back to productivity. For growth to translate into high value employment, which is what we need, it needs to be based on productivity growth. And so the goal of policy is to create that environment so that the private sector later can pick up and the burden of investment from the public sector. So what drives sustained productivity growth? The Growth Commission study, I think Dr. Ibrahim mentioned it, studied 13 countries that are able to sustain high growth, not temporarily, but long-term. Only 13 countries have been able to do this. And it's not only about income, it's about opportunity, access to services, and social protection, especially in transitions. And there's no formula. Policy making is about a group decision making, a sequence of decisions under uncertainty with continuous learning. And it's one thing to be talking about learning, but it really means that you need feedback loops. As you know, information is very difficult to come by in Sudan, and we're not monitoring enough, not creating enough feedback loops on the impact of our policies. So the common features of some of these countries: macroeconomic stability, of course, modest inflation, openness, importing knowledge and exporting, leveraging global demand, high savings and high investment, 25% plus investment rates, including public sector investments of around 5 to 7%. When you think about in Sudan, our whole budget is about 12% of GDP. More recently, our revenues now have increased a bit, but they were around 5%. Of course, you cannot sustain growth if you don't have a public sector and a private sector that has much higher levels of savings and investment. Allocative efficiency. These countries have all had markets that guide resource allocation. Leadership in institutions and governance, having a credible long-term commitment to growth, inclusion, of course, capable administration. Importantly, the presence of oil or gold or natural resources did not create sustained growth. That was not one of the features. So productivity is what connects the macroeconomy, stability, governance, to firms and to income. It's that competitive investment climate that creates and enables firm-level productivity through competition, and then employment and poverty reduction as a result. But these conditions, we have chronic macroeconomic instability, so we mentioned governance. There's some entry, but not enough exit, and competition is largely unfair. Limited investment in skills. The financial sector is not allocating resources properly. It's undercapitalized, and then infrastructure deficits, especially in transport, electricity, and of course, technology. Institutions, high quality institutions are highly correlated with rapid growth. I think we all understand this relationship. So when we consider our strategy, there are some trade-offs necessary. And why trade-offs? Because the next government will have very limited capacity. We know that. Limited political capital, limited financial capital, and limited time. It needs to produce results quickly and it needs to make choices about where it invests its limited political, economic, and financial capital. We have to rethink austerity versus growth. Can we get further gains in terms of debt sustainability? You know, the basic HIPC equation is countries reform in order to be able to have a sustainable budget, and those who are holding the debt will make concessions and grant forgiveness of that debt in exchange for that policy space that gets created, the fiscal space being used to reduce poverty. And so that's largely in the framework that we're under now, based on limiting government spending because of the inflation. It was driving inflation in the presence of limited capacity to finance. So we have to think about this quite carefully. Can we go further with austerity, or is it time to focus or rebalance toward growth? Of course, corruption, stock versus flow. This is a very sensitive issue, and I don't mean by any way to say we need to reduce any focus on corruption, but should we put in as much effort on the stock, the past, the current and past issues versus the flow, making sure corruption is addressed going forward, so that the growth, if you think about a fast growth economy, the amount of GDP you will be creating in the future is much more important than the GDP you exist with in the past. If you're talking about sustaining 7% growth over many years. So it's really about the clean growth, the ability of the economy to use resources appropriately, which of course undermined by corruption. Foreign versus domestic versus public investment. How will we focus and where will we focus? What is the role of the state? And it's a question that we shouldn't have to ask today, but frankly, the state is very dominant in many parts of the economy. Political sustainability. Now, we had a very reform program. I'll talk a little bit more about it, but many of those reforms were focusing on rents, which by necessity, addressing them had high political costs. The subsidy reform, very politically difficult, exchange rate reform, SOE reform, the customs exchange rate, tax reform, financial sector, corruption, all of which were affecting either the citizen or those parts of the economy that were taking advantage of some of those things. They were the right thing to do, and they remain the right things to do, but one has to be aware of the political cost, the difficulty and complexity, so that you need to make sure you balance that by delivering more quickly. And of course, we did, with the family support program, commodity austerity, and others, have some counterbalancing efforts to build political support and trust, but limited capacity, both in the government and the telecommunications and banking sector, limited the speed of the rollout of those programs. So at a high-level summary, the path we were going down, the SMP, then HIPC, demonstrating a track record of reform, primarily the biggest reforms focusing on governance and fiscal consolidation, as well as the exchange rate, macroeconomic stability, the Ministry of Finance's control over social spending. Moving then toward the IDA program, which was starting, but really had not yet fully, the first large IDA projects would have been approved in December, a month and a half after the coup. Had the coup not happened, the biggest IDA project would have come, the two of them, 500 million in budget support and 300 million for the electricity sector. So that was really the next stage, was to really build the economic foundations and then to support growth, which is more around private investment and trade. So the areas of progress. So fiscal deficit and fiscal dominance, we've spent a lot of time, and I don't need to spend too much more on this, but tax revenue is very, very low, among the lowest in the world at the time that we entered HIPC. And subsidies, at least in 2019, were 11% or nearly 12% of GDP, or more than 2 times all government revenues. So let alone education or health or anything else. if anything the government was spending, it had already spent more than 2 times its revenue just on fuel subsidies. So of course, any spending would be inflationary because there was not access to finance. We did demonstrate a track record of reform with some of these major reforms that happened under both under the SMP and the period after it. HIPC was essential, and it remains essential to clear the massive debt that were accumulated by the past regimes, and then open the space for multilateral finance, which is absolutely necessary to sustain growth. We had total external public debt of over 70 billion, more than 200% of GDP, of which 85% was arrears. The arrears to IMF, World Bank, African Development Bank was preventing any new access to financing from them. And we, because of the reforms, because of the clearance of arrears, the poverty strategy, the family support program, the removal of SSDL, the reconciliation process. Hello?
We are so sorry. The time come over. We'll give you 1 minute to conclusion, please.
Okay. So the most important point here is that the ECF program was largely about fiscal management and governance. If we introduce a new government comes in, the ECF has expired. It needs to be reintroduced. We need to request a formal IMF mission to take stock of the current economy and negotiate a new program. It must describe its program and its ability to implement. If it's credible, trust can be regained to restart. But debt relief does not provide investment financing alone. So we need to rely on an IDA program, which, because of some of what we lost because of the coup, we may at best get around 2 billion per year if both the full IDA allocation and special allocations, if we manage to get that support again. But the program probably needs a few shifts in focus. Number one is we need to focus on a more rapid resumption of FDI. We cannot expect a rapid resumption of FDI because of political uncertainty. We need immediate financing to make politically viable progress, visible progress. Excuse me.
Our time is
May I finish the? I will finish it. Yes, I will finish in a moment. So while we do need to maintain the direction of public financial management, there are 2 major changes. One, higher productivity enhancing investments that will drive a private sector takeoff, relaxation of some limits on non-concessional borrowing, especially to support public-private partnerships. We talked about human capital and infrastructure and productivity. I think the main point I'd like to make is on projections. So the projections the ECF were based on is that we would get to a 1.5% budget deficit in 2022 and then 1% thereafter. I think we need to negotiate a different program based on, of course, the progress that we've made, but we never reached anything close to that. We need to argue for a little bit more space.
Mr. Magdy, we are so sorry.
I am concluding now. A little bit more space fiscally to allow for the public investments which are necessary in the short run to allow productivity to take off and then the private investment to take off in the out years. So I'll leave it at that. I think that it's quite an important point if we restart the ECF to have a proper stance and to make a little bit more, allow us more budget headroom without sparking too much inflation. I think that's the main point I'm trying to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Magdy Amin.